On.
Hello, everyone. I'm Erica Anderson, Chief Customer Officer and co-founder of Storytell, and I'm so excited to have Flavio Masson here with us today. He's one of our advisors and just an incredible innovator and thinker. And so Flavio is going to take us on a journey. And as he takes us on a journey, we'd love to know where you are in the process. Where are you joining from? What reactions are you having? And so I'll share just a very little bit about Storytell, and then we're gonna dive into this journey with Flavio. And even before we begin, Flavio and I go way back as much as one can, in terms of working together in New York. And I think Flav, I would say we both care a lot about the way we interact when we're working together. How can it be fun, playful, joyful? And actually, that makes things easier. Not actually, it's pretty obvious that it's going to make things easier. And I also see us both on a journey of how does that come into how we think about design, how we think about product, how we think about innovation. So it's not just the like, oh my goodness, I love working with you, but how does that live in these artifacts around us? So just to give a little context here. So as let's see, Angela is the queen of webinars at Storytell. And so, Angela, if you could bring us to the next slide. I'm just going to speak very briefly about Storytell. We're very excited to be hosting this. So as you can see, we are recording this, so we will share the recording with you. It's being live streamed on our YouTube channel. And if you have any questions, just type them as you go, and we'll get to them as we can. But really, and welcoming your engagement. Okay, next slide. So Storytell, what is Storytell? It's a collaborative intelligence platform, really breaking down silos and really giving you the intelligence of your unstructured data. So all those meeting notes, videos, audio, etc., everything that like essentially was worthless before because we had no way to extract the value from it. Now you can with Storytell. And the whole purpose, the reason we exist is on the next slide, is to make life meaningful by making work meaningful. So again, what I was speaking to of this like joyousness of working with you, Flavio, over, I don't know, I think it's been 10 years. So congratulations to us. And and then bringing that into the everyday work experience. So moving from this, you know, industrial age hangover of widget production to let's do things as efficiently and creatively and joyously as we can. And that's why Flavio's thinking, way of being, and your work is so important to Storytell. So in case you missed it, Flavio is one of our advisors and just helps us create magical user experiences. And with that, Flavio, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Erica. Can you folks hear me okay? Erica, is the audio good? Fantastic. I'm gonna share my screen. And while I'm doing that, give me 1 second. Replacing current share. While I'm doing that, I'm gonna take just 10 seconds to introduce myself. You can call me Flav. I am the founder and chief innovation officer at Masson. We are a boutique innovation company with a social justice stance, and I founded the business in 2003, so 21 years ago. Wow, what is time? And we create interfaces, but also the stories that they carry. So we have a blend of like both product expertise as well as marketing expertise. I also like to say, and that's something that I share with Erica, that we specialize in aliveness. And in many ways, I see my practice moving from human-centered design to life-centered design. And that's a transformation that I'm being very transparent about, and I'm going to share it with you here as well. As Erica mentioned, I'm an innovation advisor at Storytell. So today we're actually taking a break from doing product work to create this workshop, which for me is like so much fun to do. All right, so for the organizers, do we have a good amount of people that we can maybe open up for folks to say like where they're dialing from, like the work that they do? Like, is that a good use of time? Yes? Okay, so who wants to either through chat or come up on camera if you feel comfortable, like come in and say like the type of work that you do, who you are, where you're dialing from? That would be really fun.
Solange, Peter, Michael, Josh, Anthony, whoever is comfortable jumping in, or even uncomfortable.
And oops. And a text message would be fine.
Yeah, and Angela, I know you got the results from our poll of where folks are joining from and so forth. So anything you can share about that in chat would be great too.
Perfect. All right. One person wants to learn about nonlinear approaches to technological innovation. So I'll get there through this presentation right now. Let's do it. So I want to start by, if you can still see my screen, orient yourselves around this question. And the question is, if you cannot read for accessibility, how might we transform innovation from tools of power and control into forces for aliveness and alignment with the living earth? And I'm going to start in a very linear way, and it's going to be chronological in the beginning, but later in the presentation, I'm going to get a little more experimental and also associative, and the concepts are going to continue to like pile up on top of each other. It's going to be, there will be like a purposeful disorientation, and but I hope that it's gonna possible to weave a quilt, so to speak, to tell a larger story. And also one disclaimer here is that I'm gonna pull a few threads that I'm gonna leave open after the call. And I'm gonna ask Angela to distribute a link with references, books, and other resources for things that I mentioned here. So you don't have to, if you don't want to take notes, there will be a comprehensive list of resources. Let me start talking about lines. What are lines? I think we know what they are. They mark paths between points, and they establish direction and boundaries. And I think that they're actually quite dangerous for those reasons, because lines, they orient us. They also reduce us sometimes. And in many ways, they limit us. And we're actually very used to lines, so much so that we often don't see lines. But if you start paying attention, they're everywhere. And we see them in the binary of politics. We see them in the lines that influence or limit human movement. We see them in the concepts around gender identity. We also see lines in the manufactured gap between economic classes. And some lines, they're so embedded in our society that they go way back in time. And they, in many ways, actually echo a very primordial need to classify very basic things like this is food or poison. This is friendly versus not friendly. So we've been practicing drawing these lines for like millennia. And some people say that we started doing that when the Judeo-Christian Judeo God first split humans from nature by telling Adam and Eve, hey, you made a mistake here, you're off this land, you're separate from nature now, so start sweating for your own food. And here you can see the man is blaming the woman for that. And but what is most relevant is that from this original separation, man began synthesizing his own food. And I will get to innovation in a second, I promise. And as you can see, laboring and selling labor in a market. And lords began to claim ownership, and not just of land, by the way, but also of peasants' labor time. And the systems of production evolved. And then there's this convenient philosophy that began to gain traction. And it goes like this. If the body is a machine, then why don't we draw yet another line between mind and body? Because then we can treat the body as an instrument of production. And production began to scale, and it happened often through intense, sometimes forced or even brutal labor systems. And of course, accounting systems emerged to track physical labor, and as was the case in cotton fields. But the Industrial Revolution inherited these controls, and it was a way to also justify class distinctions, for example, because now you have mental workers, but you have physical workers as well. There is something that I find really interesting that I wanted to share, which is that in our obsession with productivity, scientists, and in some cases artists, like Frank and Lillian Gilbreth, they popped up along the way, and they're like, let's measure human motion, and let's kind of codify those data points into charts, and let's begin to analyze the efficiency. And then across generations, linear thinkers continued to monitor and optimize the movement of our bodies, making the movements legible to management in many cases. And I don't know if you remember this, but if you remember who here remembers Amazon, because that cracks me up. Amazon was, if you're not familiar with it, Amazon was Amazon's mindfulness booth. And it's a phone booth sized pod, let's call it that, where warehouse workers could, this lasted 10 minutes, so it was banned in a second, but for a moment, users or workers could retreat for guided meditations. And thanks, Erica, for sharing that link. It was definitely a very dystopian thing that got a huge backlash. But I think the larger point here is, like, you can see as we move across time, the costumes and the photography changes, but there is this repetition of the past. And this eternal return of the same was seen by Walter Benjamin, a German philosopher, as modernity's amnesia. And basically his thinking is that innovation obscures how power recreates ancient patterns of control. So here on the left, you have Labor Day Parade here in New York City. And actually, I know that Michael Rebord used to live here by Union Square, the very place where folks came in. And actually, Labor Day was created that day. It was a way of gaining a little bit of power and having an opportunity to rest. And here on the right, you see that, well, a repetition of the past. Workers are still demanding better conditions for their experience within the companies that they work for. So I have just shown a lot of examples that are kind of like about the conditions of labor. But the fundamental line being drawn here is this illusion of being separate, is this I versus the other. line. And these are the lens through which we Westerners view the world. And I wanted to propose an activity on Fig Jam. But before we go there, I'm going to introduce a concept. And it's called something that I learned recently. It's called a Pyrrhic victory. And basically, it means that you engage in a situation where the immediate successes or success comes at such a devastating cost that you end up in a situation that was actually that is actually worse off than before. And I'm gonna illustrate that with one example, and then hopefully we can move into this Fig Jam for those that are willing to participate. And the activity works like this. X seems great because there is a benefit. And at the same time, it creates a cost that could be hidden. In some cases, it is not hidden, but the good side implies something negative. The easy example to think about is social media. So social media promises connection, but fundamentally reshapes how young people develop their identity and relationship skills. There's obviously a mental health crisis around TikTok and other technologies in this space. So I'm gonna ask Angela to share the Fig Jam link. So for anyone who's interested in hopping there, I'm gonna share my screen with the activity so that we can look at it together. You don't have to participate. You can watch the board getting populated. And here we go. I'm gonna share the link here on chat. I see anonymous people coming in, which is always fun to see. Boom. I see Josh here. I see an anonymous person. Great. So I'm going to invite you to do this. Consider the prompts here on the left side, how dominant innovations affect your time or impact your finances. They may occupy your attention, affect your sleep, a bunch of other things. And if you're familiar with, and I see Angela is already populating the board, if you're familiar with how Fig Jam works, you can basically move your cursor to the bottom of the screen, drag a little post-it note, and then type anything you want inside the post-it note. There are zoom controls. So on a PC or Macintosh, you can pinch zoom and get the screen to be larger or smaller, and that's how you navigate the space. On a Mac, you can pan around with 2 fingers. Then if you want to put your post-its side by side, I think that what I'm interested in is seeing how there is something good on the left that has a cost on the right. That's basically the gist of the activity. I see Josh drawing a line here. I didn't know you could do it that way, but that's great.
Hey, Flav. One quick thing is, I don't know if anyone else is experiencing this, but as I'm in the Figma, the ability to create a post-it is grayed out for me. It says view only, and so I sent a request. So
Oh, yes, I see what you mean. Yes, I got a notification here. So I changed permissions,
great.
and I'm glad you brought it up.
Okay, I'll disappear again.
Yes, thank you, Erica. So virtual learning platforms, flexibility, accessibility in learning new things, but at the same time, lack of in-person interaction can lead to feelings of isolation for learners. You know, isolation is a thing that I hear more and more about. Like, we have done a lot of work in the healthcare space, and the cost of isolation has far-reaching impact on people's health, especially more vulnerable populations, in particular Medicare Advantage populations that I have more experience with, like 65 plus populations. That is a huge problem. So yes, it also happens in a learning context. Yes, Josh, cheap entertainment, Netflix and Spotify, access to content anytime and anywhere, and the cheapening of ideas, feeling burned out by radical ideas, right? Needing to consume numbing content. Yeah, this is really powerful. And actually, there's kind of like this looping quality of that, right? Because Netflix learns about what resonates the most with people, tracking the behavior of clicks and when people pause and continue replayed sections to actually create new content. So some sort of echo chamber. Also, access to all the world's knowledge at all or any time. Lack of hierarchy of information and ideas. Yes, for sure. And also lower attention span, I find is also a consequence of that. That's such a good point. Yes, there is lots to think about here. I see new post-its here. Thanks, Erica, for the chat. Recommendation algorithms promise getting served products that are targeted to our needs. Echo chambers and silos. You know what? There is something really interesting that I was reading by a Greek thinker, actually, and he says that capitalism is over and that now we live in an era of what he calls techno-feudalism. So it's a form of feudalism, but technocentric way. And his rationale is that in capitalism, you had these free markets and people came in with their products and like in some sort of like piazza or marketplace. And that now like the centralization of algorithms establishing what it is that we see, that those algorithms are driven by whatever generates the most profit to the party holding the algorithm. And that definitely creates like a limitation. So I think that's such a good point. Echo chambers and silos there in e-commerce experience. I see more here. Virtual learning platforms, virtual games allow indoor entertainment without the need to go outside. Oh yeah. Future health-related problems, yes. My goodness, movement. There's so much data around movement and its benefits for health. So this is really powerful. Well, thank you. I wanted to get an X-ray into everyone's minds. So I think this helps me really understand what's going on in your world. Definitely echoes my experience as well. I'm gonna take a moment here to transition back into the presentation. If you have any questions or comments about this activity, feel free to put it in chat. And
Just jumping in with a comment, I love this like collaborative experience here with what Louise had shared, and also dropped this in chat, but Jonathan Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation, that came out this year, really
oh yeah, I
talks
haven't seen
about
that.
he calls it the great rewiring of childhood, from a play-based childhood to a phone-based childhood. And part of that is that, yeah, for sure impact on our physical health, and then so much more. But just wanted to share that language in case it's helpful.
Yeah, it's so helpful. I recently heard about iPad parenting through Ezra Klein's podcast. And I was like, oh, wow, yeah, that's a helpful term. As I see happening like all over me and here in Brooklyn in particular, like it seems to be very pervasive. Thank you, folks. This is really good. I'm gonna go back to the presentation and actually I'm gonna reorient ourselves over the initial question, which was how might we transform innovation from tools of power and control into forces for aliveness? And I'm going to introduce a character here, which is a person that typically does not have access to Global North conversations. His name was Nego Bispo, and he was a Brazilian leader and poet and philosopher and activist who passed away last year, and actually almost exactly a year ago. He was a Quilombola, and Quilombolas are descendants of people who escaped slavery in Brazil, and they created autonomous communities of resistance. And I'm calling out these communities because they maintain a circular way of thinking and being that predates colonial and linear frameworks. And Erica, when I spoke with Erica about this, she very smartly asked me to clarify what I mean about circular ways of thinking. And I really mean understanding the world through relationships and patterns of reciprocity. In the mind of a nonlinear thinker, everything is connected and in dialogue rather than separated by lines. So circular thinking does not mean being stuck in a loop. And actually, Nego Bispo illustrates how Quilombolas think and act in a circular way. And he does that by contrasting two forms of play that I wanted to run by you folks. The first one is soccer. We all know the game, right? So imagine you're in the bleachers of a modern day soccer game, and maybe you're watching England versus France, and your favorite team is losing. And even if you have a lot of energy, you can't just like run into the field. You cannot jump over barriers and join the game. The game is protected by lines and the rules are fixed. The players cannot switch teams. The spectators are stuck in passive observation mode. And essentially everyone stays kind of like in their designated areas until the final whistle blows. And it's no surprise that soccer was invented by colonizers. And actually it exemplifies linear thinking. And guess what? Before it even became FIFA's proprietary game, it was played in China as Cuju, and it was played in Greece as Episkiros. And that's actually, I find a pretty classic colonizer move of appropriation, because basically they put lines around the game and they said, this is my game. And actually FIFA owns it today, and it's a very powerful and profitable game. But then the question that surfaces for me is, as innovators, are we operating within linear games too? What I'm sharing here is an overlay between soccer, which I consider like a very linear game, with a game of innovation. And if you're an innovation practitioner, chances are you have played the game of the double diamond. And what are these lines? Who owns them? Do any of you feel these lines are like there in innovation, or is it just me? And actually, a lot of academics, I'm going to skip through this pause and go directly into the content, because you can see that this is widely adopted by innovators across the world, and everybody has their version of the double diamond, as it's called. And we have been trying to theorize design practices and conceptualize these practices for a really long time, but it wasn't until the UK Design Council undertook the challenge of creating a framework the double diamond design framework to define a process. And practitioners, obviously, as you can see, they voraciously adopted these models, and actually that's something that aligns with what many scholars refer to managerialism, which is this belief that professional management's value is kind of like tied to routine applications of these quote unquote scientific methods. Scholars think that it's not very genuine because it's reinforcing ways of knowing and producing knowledge that at the same time silences other ways of knowing and being. And it's very mechanical and it's very linear, which means it's great for controlling outcomes. And for that reason, I like to put curtains around it sometimes, and I call it innovation theater, because in many ways, it's just like playing processes that are basically predetermined to arrive at outcomes that are an expression of what can also be referred to as dominant design. And I talk a lot about dominant design, both at work. Did you like the curtains, Erica? Yes. Because they get in the way of change. And I'm going to explain through the concept of institutionalism. And that means basically a system where knowledge and power flow through official channels. And these official channels are like experts and institutions and frameworks that become essentially the gatekeepers of what counts as valid, which gets, of course, treated as universal, as if there's one set of rules and assumptions that work everywhere for everyone. And we all know the famous examples of, like, Barbie saviors going into Africa and like doing the water well, and then everything looks good in the pictures, but the well breaks 6 months later and there's no maintenance. The solutions are seen as universal and immediately applied to everyone and everywhere. And solutionism is also part of the equation. Solutionism actually aligns with this discourse. And it's always aiming to change what exists into desirable outcomes. Desirable outcomes, but desirable to whom, right? Like, who benefits from these solutions? In our sugar-saturated world, diabetes medications are highly desirable and of course super profitable. Sugar is very profitable, but there's a twist here, which is that the more sugar consumed, the more diabetes medications are needed. And of course, when you step back, prevention is way more desirable than treating diabetes, but sadly, rarely profitable. So the incentives are not aligned with upstream attention. And there's a concept here that I want to talk about, these constructs where a manufactured desire hides more fundamental and systemic ideas. When these things become so ingrained that they're invisible and maybe even dismissed as a fact of life, that's called reification. And I noticed recently that value proposition templates, which I'm sharing one here, you can download them off the web. There's like a million versions of them. They always show like a pill icon for pain relievers. And the logic is that problems are actually symptoms to be managed rather than systems to be transformed. So the question that surfaces for me is, our very frameworks for understanding value are trapping us in this cycle of like treating effects instead of like looking at the causes that are like putting us in these situations. So how do we go about possibilities that are out of line? Like, how can we shape our collective futures if the tools that we're using are already putting us downstream? But also, And as important, innovation systems are bound by even more lines. Whose knowledge counts as expertise, what relationships need to be in place first, who you summer with in Nantucket, who you golf with. All of these things are preventing you from having access to the innovation unit where changes happen. One more thing that is very prominent these days, and that's DEI initiatives, right? So we all know diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. The trouble with them being they're reinforcing the same patterns, right? You still have like lines and someone who's in control of those lines, gatekeeping the space. It continues to be a game of boundaries and permissions. It continues to be a game of insiders and outsiders. I left the story of Negobispo, and I'm going to come back to say that Negobispo showed us a second form of play, and it's completely circular, and it's called Capoeira, and Brazilians pronounce it Capoeira, and it's a game created by his elders and nonlinear thinkers, and they escaped from slavery and created the game as an act of resistance. And more precisely, it was invented in the 16th century in Brazil. It's kind of like a combination of martial arts and dance and music, and it's definitely like a circular technology that brings bodies into harmony. And here you don't have like, it is a fight, but it isn't a fight. They are not opponents, they're actually players, and they see themselves as co-creators of movement. And I'm gonna play an animation, and while I play this animation, I'm gonna read a few observations that I jotted down watching a circle of capoeira recently, which is that at an individual level, you literally go upside down sometimes, which I think is helpful as a way to kind of like invert your perspective and see things from a different angle. And the movements are conversations, like people are actually exchanging information with one another, understanding their limits, what they can and cannot do, how flexible they are in relation to other people. These are things at the individual level, but then at the collective level, it creates this kind of coherence across multiple bodies. They're moving in the shared space. Some people are producing music outside of the circle. And unlike soccer, the identities kind of flow because you can be changing teams, and there is no time limit. You can be a child, you can be 80 years old. You can actually enter and exit and create at will. There's no audition, there's no membership card. There's no way to participate. You're automatically in by just being there. And actually, I also noticed that these games happen typically in public. Everybody can witness what's going on. There's no lines between what is seen and unseen. And then I've shown this before, and people go like, okay, that's really romantic because, I cannot dance my way into possible futures. But the reality is that this porosity that you see in capoeira circles, this radical openness, actually exists as a model of change. And I like to share the example of Ireland, for example, where 99 random people they were farmers, they were teachers, shop owners. They spent 5 weekends studying the country's abortion ban. And they spent all this time like learning from experts and educating themselves. And at the end of this process, their very thoughtful deliberation helped change one of Europe's most conservative countries toward a place where actually abortion is now possible. So the circles, they sound theoretical, but actually when we create porous spaces and people can flow through the spaces, change can actually happen. Imagine how in 1940s in Brazil, the government went around the country with a very aggressive campaign to regularize land ownership through very bureaucratic processes. And it was basically a way to dispossess indigenous people from their lands because they had no deeds, you know? So imagine the shock when these linear thinkers arrived and the indigenous people basically said, we don't even know, we don't own this land actually owns us. And the anthropologists who thought were experts, they were completely paralyzed before a sort of truth that their frameworks just could not contain. But anyway, what happened very early on was that Nego's elders, they made a very strategic decision to send a very young Nego to school. And he was just long enough to learn reading and writing. And we know that reading and writing is a very powerful technology that can give you access to places. And then a blur began to happen. In this case, reading and writing began to blur these lines. And Quilombolas and indigenous folks, as an alliance, began to get integrated and listened. And I bring up the blur because as professionals in technology, we are already in the system. We are blurring these lines, and we have gained fluency in what is perhaps the most powerful language of the day. And we get gigs, we get jobs, we're on LinkedIn, we're in the marketplace. So the question for me really becomes, where might we, or where should we lose our politeness for lines, allowing what seems fixed to become maybe more wobbly or malleable? And perhaps getting close to the end of the presentation, I want to talk about three, there's an infinite levels of play, but I believe that roughly they are clustered in three levels. And the first level is the very boring and serious play that Erica and I, we have worked together for like a decade at this point, and in past lives, we have been through these processes, right? Like innovation workshops and double diamond and brainstorming sessions. And a lot of it is really like rooted in the same mechanistic worldview that is very preoccupied with outcomes that are beneficial to the sponsoring party. But the reality is that our challenges, the challenges that we have today and our polycrises, they're too complex for this type of simplicity. I like to think of them as kind of like, this type of play is like rearranging chairs on the deck of the Titanic, basically. It gives an illusion of progress, but it's basically meaningless. The second level, I think here things get a little more interesting because design processes become a little more emergent. And they require psychological safety because you begin to question not only the outcomes of the work, but also entire frameworks. And here we begin mapping power structures, for example, and understanding positionality, not as an intellectual exercise, but as a way to make things that are invisible visible. So the play also becomes more authentic at this point. And finally, level 3, and it's cut off on purpose. Level 3 is totally free, and it's outside of the frame. It can actually double reality, and it can conceive of new worlds. Think of utopia, or think of dystopia. You know, these are visions of like entire new experiences that help us imagine what's possible. This is often played for its own sake, and it's like very transgressive, very queer, and it's transgressive precisely because it refuses to be limited by lines in any sort of way. Earlier in the presentation, I showed you this graphic here, which is a piece by an indigenous artist, actually. She belongs to a tribe called Yanomami. And I saw it at this year's Venice Biennale, where the curator himself, Brazilian and so global South person and queer, he transformed Europe's most prestigious art event into a platform for artists who had been basically excluded for centuries. And here's the curator. So I'm walking around the Biennale and I see people arriving in traditional dresses and people wearing Prada suits are like, what the hell? And the Brazilian pavilion was renamed using a name that actually local indigenous people have used before it was labeled Brazil. And of course, Europeans and a lot of Europeans and gallery owners were dismissing the whole thing as folkloric, and they called the whole thing like, this is not art. But that's exactly the intent that Adriano had, which was to expose these colonial assumptions about what constitutes real art and who gets to decide. This presentation is linear and it's limited by time, so it has to end, unfortunately, but obviously the practice continues. Definitely for me, I feel like I'm beginning to learn some of these principles and putting them in practice with people like Erica and others. And I'm not going to give anyone any kind of playbook because I think that disorientation is the point and everyone's process is different. But I do want to open the floor either to the organizers, but also for participants, if you feel inclined to say something, give us any kind of feedback.
Make a
This is
sound.
like a Q&A, make a sound. Yes, everything is welcome. So thank you, Erica. Thank you, Louise and Angela, for organizing this so brilliantly. And come on if you have any comments or questions, please.
I think we do have a few. And Josh, thanks for sharing with us about you. Great to have Portland, Oregon represented. And we've got a question from Jamie. The contrast between capoeira and soccer beautifully illustrates two different modes of engagement. How can we translate the principles of capoeira, which I realize now I'm not pronouncing in the Brazilian way, into our daily work practices to foster more inclusive and creative environments?
Yes, oh, I say this often that I do not have the answers, and that's kind of part of the beautiful practice that I feel like we're all in. But the way I like to do this, to perform this practice, is to pay attention to where movement is not flowing. So in innovation, I often feel limited by questions, limited by comments that are like, no, like you cannot do this. Like, why would you do this? This is not how we have done things in the past. And these are moments where you notice that motion is actually stuck. I think of capoeira and I like to watch it myself because the movement goes from A to B to C without pause. So sometimes when we're working, you get these blocks to the process, and you're like, okay, so what is preventing us from going fluidly from A to B to C? So I realized that this is not like a very prescriptive answer, but it's an answer that demands silent and slow attention to these moments of blocked energy, for lack of a better expression.
I
Does
I
that
love
help?
Yeah, I love how you're bringing that in so many ways. One, it makes me think of the poet Rilke's, "Live the questions,"
Oh,
and
you mentioned this.
because versus I have a prescription for you, which then is very much this lines and confined, contained experience. And also I hear you saying like, where is it stagnant? And what do we need to do to like allow it to flow? And it reminds me, I've watched capoeira, I've never done it. I've done five rhythms, and I remember at a five rhythms dancing activity, the the DJ and facilitator was saying, "Hey, just touch the part of your, partner's, your dancing partner's body where they're not moving. Um, how can you bring movement into that? And looks like we've got um, a question from Josh. So curious to hear how we might learn from practices like capoeira about balancing the existing slash historical scaffolding of line slash movement into a more open, playful, responsive movement. And how might that be applied to our double diamonds, whatever they might be, in our own disciplines? So maybe a similar vein here.
Yes, I love that question. And it is a similar vein, but I'll go a little more specific about frameworks because I picked on the double diamond today. But there are a bunch of other frameworks that are designed for predicting processes. They're also designed for limiting time because that is a logic that is conducive to contracts, right? So we're going to work for like 8 weeks. We're going to do discovery for this long, design for this long, develop for this long. So it's very convenient because they can put their head around it and say like, oh, great. So we need to like come out on the other side with a solution for like the world's largest, most wicked problems. The practice that I have slowly over time adopted in my business is what I call emergent design, which basically comes from a place of not knowing. We do not or ever promise that the next step or stop in the process is, for instance, to design something or to develop something. We may actually invert the sequence of events. The logic is that the step right ahead of us is completely blurry. I think that part of the courage to admit that we're going into innovation from a place of unknowing is what is key here. Like we cannot predict, especially in times of polycrises and all these variables that we're dealing with, we can't possibly predict an activity that's going to happen like even before we discover what the data is telling us. So part of the mechanistic way of working is that we're kind of like converge, diverge, converge, diverge, converge, diverge. And it's like, why are we being like up and down like this when in reality we have to actually get off this train, promote like silent attention to data and really like this low attention to data and get really intimate with it. And of course, like the more intersectional the data is, the better the work will be to unlock the next step. So emergent design is essentially a series of steps that get unlocked with each action that you take, with each step of learning.
It feels really enjoyable. Like I feel a flow when you're just speaking to this as opposed to a, I don't know, tuck, 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 like, um, just it's yeah, just like how organic it is of I don't know how to get to the final step in this puzzle until I play with this first puzzle piece. And then I'll find that whole like stepping stones metaphor. But I also want to bring something around like a hearing you say the word data. I'm guessing, but correct me if I'm wrong, if like data is this inclusive concept that it's not just you and I are looking at numbers, um, but it includes cultural wisdom. Like maybe if I can form a question now at last, what do you mean when you say that?
There is Yeah, this is such a long conversation. I recently read a study done by Plural Insight around this because let's consider the data that is used to measure the effectiveness of developers, which is a hot topic. Like developers are on the spot here because they're actually conceiving and kind of like making the magic happen in terms of like, voila, they're like making the technology appear, and it's kind of like this alchemy. So developers are on the spot because the folks that are like leading the initiatives, they're trying to get the most out of developers. And what studies have proven, and in particular this studies by Plural Insight, I will share with Angela, and Angela will make it part of the bibliography package. The data is showing how the measurement of effectiveness of employees, like in a way that is quantitative, is completely missing the mark. It's actually not capturing the emotion that developers are having at the workplace, nor the variables that are actually affecting their performance. So data, sometimes it feels very satisfying to feel that we have processes and ways of collecting it. But that doesn't mean that because we can collect that data, that it's helping us make the best decisions. And a lot of the data, the more qualitative data, is actually what's driving the experience of developers, which in turn is driving the quality of their output. I'll give one example. There's no research out there about the efficiency of the development team that gets into the quality of sleep. But sleep, on the other hand, has been proven to be the main factor in terms of like how much it dictates the quality of the output, by not only developers, like anybody in the business of work. But it's something that is like typically not part of the data being collected.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. That makes sense. I think again, it's like this holistic, how do we see the whole? That's part of what I'm hearing from you.
Yes, and I'll share just one more screen to go back to emergent design practices. The future is blurry, so I want to like leave everyone with this visual. And the best that we can do is like unlock an activity, learn from it, and take the next step. Is it circles? Is it triangles? Only the future will tell us. Like there is no formula. The formula is having no formula.
Amazing. That's a beautiful note to end on. Thank you so, so much, Flavio, for taking us on this journey. And thank you everyone who joined for going on the journey with us, liberating ourselves from lines, opening to circles and other shapes, other ways of being.
Yes, to all shapes.
All right. We're going to end it here. If you have any feedback for us at Storytell, we always want to do better and engage with everyone who's joining us. So thank you, Flavio. Thank you, everyone. I think we'll leave it here.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks,
Bye.
Hope. Okay. Yeah.